Hey there, let's talk about chapter 2 of The Magician's Nephew. Chapter 2, Diggory and His Uncle. If you missed my discussion of chapter 1 with my intro for the book as a whole, you can click the link up in the corner there to start at the beginning. Or if not, let's jump on into chapter 2. So Polly just touched the yellow ring and vanished into thin air. This chapter is going to be an intense conversation between Diggory and his uncle that follows that, which is going to open up some interesting detail about the characters of Diggory and his uncle and about the moral and motivational drives that make them who and what they are, which are then going to be explored as well throughout the rest of the book. And this chapter also includes the memorable backstory about spooky old Mrs. Lefay and how the worlds connect. So let's jump into it. So Polly disappears and Diggory screams, pretty natural reaction since he was already starting to freak and had been shouting, "Polly, don't touch it," you know. And so Uncle Andrew grabs him and puts a hand over his mouth. And right away he uses Diggory's mother to make him be quiet. So the line is, "None of that. If you start making a noise, your mother will hear it, and you know what a fright might do to her." And both the narrator and Diggory see that comment as really unthinkable. The narrator says, as Diggory said afterward, the horrible meanness of getting at a chap in that way almost made him sick. But of course, he didn't scream again. Maybe in a way, this is kind of foreshadowing some of the character exposition that's going to follow of Diggory and his uncle and their motivations. Because his uncle is fixated on power, and Diggory is driven by love, particularly love for his mother. And his uncle's life philosophy is really to use any means possible to get what he wants, no matter the cost. So when dealing with someone like Diggory, Uncle Andrew's instinct and reflexes are to use anything, regardless of the impact it might have on others. And Diggory's way of interpreting this is to call it horrible meanness, and it makes him feel sick. And maybe the reason it makes him feel sick is maybe because in that quick moment, Uncle Andrew's split-second instinct revealed such a distinctly antisocial orientation that Diggory intuitively realizes, he just intuits the fact that there's probably very little that Uncle Andrew would hesitate to do to somebody if he thought it was worth it. Anyway, so the discussion goes on, and finally, Uncle Andrew ends up saying he's going to let Diggory in on what happened. And so when he does that, he starts by going back and bringing up old Mrs. Lefay, which would be Uncle Andrew's godmother. This was somebody who Diggory's mother had never wanted to talk about, and when Diggory looks at her photograph, his thought is that it's, quote, not at all a nice face, which is an interesting comment, and we'll get to that in a minute. But anyway, so turns out Mrs. Lefay had ended up in prison for who knows why, but she got out before she died, and that's when Uncle Andrew had had his last conversation with her. It's also interesting in passing, as the story unfolds, Uncle Andrew makes the passing comment, she had got to dislike ordinary, ignorant people, you understand. I do myself. Which I think is an interesting side comment along the way that just kind of shows us a little bit about C.S. Lewis's relational value system. Because the villains here belittle those who don't have as much intelligence or potential or whatever, whereas the heroes in Lewis's stories tend to honor and value those who are weak or small or relatively insignificant. Anyway, so Uncle Andrew goes on and says that when he got to see her before she died, she had him fetch a little box out of a secret hidden drawer that nobody knew about. And then she made him promise to, quote, burn it unopened with certain ceremonies. So we'll get to that in a minute. But now back to that comment about not at all a nice face. So I think this is just a fun little atmospheric touch almost that Lewis puts into the story here. In a way, he's playing on what we might call the fairy tale aesthetic. Good people are beautiful, bad people are ugly. This is something you'll especially see if you look at the original forms of some of our modern classic fairy tales, which I haven't done myself, but I've heard from people who have that when you go back and look at the sources, this is something that's actually made explicit sometimes even, that you might, for example, meet somebody and then you can breathe a sigh of relief because it's a beautiful princess who you can trust. Or, you might meet somebody at a glance and see how ugly and evil you better watch out for your life, that kind of thing. And of course, we recognize, of course, this isn't how the real world works. But I think it's part of how symbolic elements factor into the atmospheric level of storytelling. Beauty comes to represent for us the beauty of goodness. Ugliness comes to represent for us the ugliness of evil. Not unlike the kind of symbolism in a story like The Picture of Dorian Gray, which I also haven't read, but I think it's a very fascinating story concept. Now, of course, we're not going to take this line as some kind of comment from C.S. Lewis on actual aesthetics or, let's say, phrenology or something like that, because Lewis also includes beautiful witches in his stories, most notably Queen Jadis in this story here. So while he recognizes that evil can look beautiful, I think he's touching on that more classic trope and maybe also using it for a atmospheric effect. We're supposed to imagine old Mrs. Lefay as having a creepy, unkind look on her face, the marks of evil. Because even though characters like, let's say, the Green Lady from the Silver Chair may be beautiful as a contradiction of the ugliness inside, other characters, like the hag in Prince Caspian, use that fairy tale aesthetic to symbolically express the ugliness of their hearts on the outside. And then there are also characters like, let's say, the gnomes in the Silver Chair underground, or like the Marshwiggles, or the Council of Owls that meets in the middle of the night and scares the kids a little bit. There are these other ones that look as if they ought to be seen as ugly or dark or frightening or bad, but in fact, on the inside, they're the most beautiful children of Aslan that you're ever going to find in Narnia. And I wonder also if maybe the description of Mrs. Lefay may go a little bit beyond superficial ugliness, merely superficial ugliness, but may also include as a secondary or maybe even a primary element, maybe the idea that her facial expression and the effects that little facial expressions over time can make onto your permanent features. Because if you remember, and there's a later chapter, which we haven't got to yet, but there's a later chapter when Diggory and Polly find the rulers of Charn basically in stasis as statues in this big old lineup. And the children walk up the line of the faces, and as they go, they see the gradual process of corruption is seen on their faces by the transition from the earlier ones had this kindness and strength on their faces. And as they go along, they see faces that begin to look more and more cruel and frightening. So, when Diggory thinks that old Mrs. Lefay's photo was, quote, not at all a nice face, this may have meant that she was just generically ugly, like a hag whose hair is a mess and she's just kind of ugly. Or perhaps maybe it was more primarily about those kinds of facial features, that her face looked frightening because she looked cruel and frightening. Less for that superficial, just kind of a background spookiness, and more as a symbolic representation for us of Mrs. Lefay's character kind of showing through on her face. The idea that just like those corrupt later rulers of Charn, Mrs. Lefay was the kind of person you don't want to mess with. I read a while back about an interesting empirical study that was done where psychologists examined the perceived phenomenon of where we will all instinctively evaluate strangers based on the impression you get from their face and other things that you get in a glance. Now, to state the obvious, of course, the only way to understand somebody is to actually meet them and get to know them. But what the study suggested was that every one of us does, at least to some extent, quote unquote, judge the book by its cover. And we all have some amount of unconscious intuition that certain people may be more kind or less kind. Certain people may be more trustworthy or less more conscientious, whatever. Things that we wouldn't necessarily be able to put into words. For example, this person looks like a nice, safe stranger. This other person looks like a mean person I would like to avoid. That kind of thing that we might intuit based on their face and other factors that you might see at a glance. And we do this without even knowing or realizing that we're really doing it. And while, of course, those kinds of judgments can be completely wrong, what the study suggested was that they actually do have a certain low percent accuracy in that sometimes you are right. Not enough to warrant actual confidence, but enough to be statistically significant. And the study suggested that one of the many tiny factors, so they didn't identify what the factors could scientifically be identified to be, but they suggested some possibilities. And one of them that they suggested for the things that people are intuitively reading into, which would prejudice them for or against somebody. One of the things might be facial features, which could be sometimes completely irrelevant, but sometimes maybe some of these facial features are things that are the result of certain facial expressions being used repeatedly over the course of somebody's life until it actually affects your features. So, how somebody looks is certainly an unreliable way to evaluate somebody and could amount to a form of prejudice, really, especially for those poor, unfortunate people who have a quote unquote resting mad face or a resting sad face for no fault of their own. But the reason we do judge a book by its cover is because experientially we have instincts that have some low percent of accuracy in a hit or miss, but statistically significant kind of way about what we intuit the cover of the book to be telling us about the book. So anyway, I think that that universal human instinct and how we all do judge a book by its cover, I think that kind of helps us understand a little bit about where that fairy tale aesthetic came from and why it makes sense artistically in a context of fiction like this, a very imaginative kind of fiction, even though it would obviously be horribly misleading and misguiding if we took it literally. And I think you could say that in the Narnia books in general, Lewis includes a combination of characters that you can tell instantly are evil for artistic effect, since all the Narnia stories are extended modern fairy tales with classical influences. So characters like the later corrupt rulers of Charn, or like the wolves and ogres in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, as well as characters that are just the opposite and actually use their charm to convince others that they are the goodest of the good, such as the Green Lady who bewitched Prince Rilian in The Silver Chair, or like the gentle giants of Harfang in the same book. In the case of Mrs. Lefay, maybe it's both a superficial atmospheric spookiness effect, as well as also a symbolic representation of Mrs. Lefay's character. That just like those corrupt later rulers of Charn, Mrs. Lefay was that kind of person you just don't want to mess with. So, in other words, you would get a really uneasy feeling the moment you met her just by your first look at her face. In fact, I don't think it'd be too much of a stretch to suggest that Diggory would have a limited amount of fear of Mrs. Lefay instinctively, whereas Uncle Andrew, as he put it, she was always very kind to me. So even wicked witches are kind to some people. Uncle Andrew's relationship with fear is displaced by his experiences and his point of view. And the reason I emphasize the fear aspect is because that's going to become an important theme as we get further into the chapter. So in light of that, I think we can kind of stretch that backward to this point and say, hey, Uncle Andrew's lack of fear was offset by something like love. Perhaps we could say relational connection, or maybe to use his word, kindness, because it's not really love in any authentic sense, I don't think. But it's this relationship that was probably a significant part of what influenced his journey. It reminds me of in the Harry Potter universe, I think it was in book 6 where they finally found out that the grumpy house elf creature, who's fiercely loyal to the Dark Wizard movement, we find out that he had long ago been horrifically betrayed by the head of that movement, long before our characters had even met him. And after they found out this, there's this point where Harry is kind of cynically just pointing out this kind of self-contradiction there with bitter resentment for a creature. And then Hermione finally says, "Come on, Harry. Creature doesn't think like that. He's loyal to people who are kind to him, and all these dark wizard family members he lived with, Mrs. Black and all the rest, were really awful people, but they were the only people who were at least somewhat kind to him." And I think we kind of see something similar here. Mrs. Lefay is implied to be a really awful person. She ended up in prison because she made it her lifestyle to push moral boundaries and get what she wants at any cost to others. But she liked Uncle Andrew, or maybe felt that she had use for him, so she acted kindly to him, whatever. But as a result of that positive experience and relational connection, Uncle Andrew admires her and wants to be like her. And then as he grew up, he ended up following in her footsteps. Anyway, so the next bit of the story gives us a peek through the window into Uncle Andrew's moral values. Because remember, we just found out that Mrs. Lefay on her deathbed gave him that secret box and made him promise to burn it with certain particular ceremonies. And Uncle Andrew finishes the story by saying, "That promise I did not keep." And Diggory says, "Well, then it was jolly rotten of you." "Rotten?" said Uncle Andrew with a puzzled look. "Oh, I see. You mean that little boys ought to keep their promises. Very true, most right and proper, I'm sure, and I'm very glad you have been taught to do it. But of course you must understand that rules of that sort, however excellent they may be for little boys, and servants, and women, and even people in general, can't possibly be expected to apply to profound students and great thinkers and sages. No, Diggory, men like me who possess hidden wisdom are freed from common rules just as we are cut off from common pleasures. Ours, my boy, is a high and lonely destiny." And I think this may be the most important paragraph in the whole chapter, maybe one of the most memorable quotations in the whole book. It's particularly spotlighted because later on the witch is going to quote part of that as a coincidence orchestrated by the author. She's going to end up quoting verbatim part of that. And I think that helps us see a certain amount of the intentionality and artistic structure that's put into the book here. Because this moral statement was so important to C.S. Lewis's vision for his book that he not only wrote Uncle Andrew's vision statement for his moral vision here, but he introduced it near the beginning of the book here in this chapter, and then he reiterated it near the end of the book after we've already had time to see it kind of expressed and played out by the characters throughout the narrative, because this is something we're not supposed to miss. So I think you could suggest that Lewis's portrayal of these villains and the very clear and detailed exposition of this perspective on moral theory is one of the main points of the book, in addition to the themes I've already mentioned about relationships, temptation, desires, etc. The following paragraph is also very helpful. It says, as he said this, he sighed and looked so grave and noble and mysterious that for a second Diggory really thought he was saying something rather fine, which is an old use of the word fine. So maybe in 2025, we might use a word like sophisticated or elegant or noble. The point is that for a minute, Diggory felt like he could buy it. And then he remembered the ugly look he'd seen on his uncle's face a minute ago. This is one of the things I love about Lewis's stark two-dimensional villains in this children's story he wrote. Even though everything is two-dimensional and kind of fairy tale sort of style, he still wants the children to be the readers to be actively thinking about the philosophical moral questions in view. So Diggory believes his uncle for a minute. This is such an interesting and compelling aspect of the story because Lewis is telling a fairy tale about morality, and yet he doesn't fall into the common amateur trap or the pulp fiction trap of dismantling straw men or preaching at the reader. Even though his target audience is young children, Lewis still makes it a point to make immorality and evil sound compelling. He wants his young children readers to look at the attractiveness of this option and consider it, and continue to consider it, as he uses his extended narrative to demonstrate through story how unfulfilling that course of life actually is ultimately and why. Here in chapter 2, neither Diggory nor anybody else actually refutes Uncle Andrew's point of view directly. Instead, those ideas are allowed to rest in the air as an unrefuted but clearly despicable way to live. What refutes Uncle Andrew's moral vision is not any verbal refutation from Diggory in this chapter, but instead it's the narrative refutation provided by the rest of the story as a whole. And maybe that's partly because it's in fact in the realm of story or experience that we may find some of the strongest arguments for whether to follow good or evil. Story, either in the form of the divine human story, which this book here definitely touches on in order to articulate the meaningfulness and the scope of what it means to follow the author of good, who is the only perfect intersection between true love and true power. So whether it's in the form of the divine human story or in the form of story as lived experience within society over time, in other words, the basis for the ancient wisdom that the wise men of ancient times tended to articulate in various cultures throughout the world, which tended to include a moral element of wisdom and the assumption that experience teaches us to not be the fool and to not be the wicked. I'm thinking most explicitly of what I'm most familiar with, the Hebrew wisdom tradition found in books of the Bible like Proverbs. But similar wisdom traditions are found in many parts of the world. And the general idea is that experience teaches, and the wise are the people who are sharing the collective experience of past generations. The wise are the people who are learning from the past, sharing the wisdom of experience. Anyway, so back to old Mrs. Lefay. So Uncle Andrew explains that she was, quote, one of the last mortals in this country who had fairy blood in her. And that makes her his fairy godmother. And the box, he would later find out, was Atlantean, so older than the Stone Age. But in the meanwhile, around this time, Uncle Andrew had been continuing to learn more about magic. And it's implied that this is a dark kind of thing. That's implied by certain lines. Uncle Andrew says it wouldn't be proper to explain such and such to a child. He says that his pursuit included some, quote, very disagreeable experiences, etc. So Uncle Andrew's continued pursuit of magic during that time period is another characteristic of Uncle Andrew's questionable moral character, which he inherited from Mrs. Lefay. And this is the case even though the kind of magic discussed in this story is never equated with, let's say, the demonic or the spiritual. It seems that Lewis has created a fairly unique space in this book for non-Narnian magic, in which magicians are people who are tampering with things they don't understand and generally doing immoral or inappropriate things in order to do so, even though the result is somewhat like the standard fairy tale kind of magic, in which magic equals a set of laws of nature associated with fantasy and myth. I think Lewis probably did this, maybe partly because he was aware of the possible dissonance that comes from combining fairy tale magic with a real world type of context. This is the opposite, I think, to what was done in the first Harry Potter book. In that book, Rowling equated Hogwarts magic with the historical concept of witchcraft and suggested this is why magical persons in the Harry Potter universe need to try to hide from non-magical society. I'm guessing Rowling probably did this in order to try to position her fantasy narrative in opposition to tragic moments of history such as the Salem witch trials. Maybe she was influenced as well by the Satanic Panic, which ran through the 80s and 90s. The first Harry Potter book was 1998. So it wouldn't surprise me if maybe that was even a trend at the time to make witches the heroes, just to stand against the uh, really tragically false accusations that only came to light gradually through time. But the unfortunate result of this, from a Christian point of view, is that stories like Harry Potter Book One seem to make an ambiguous suggestion that if there were such a thing as witchcraft or occult power, then it would probably be a good thing. I think C.S. Lewis, writing 40 years before that, was doing something similar, but coming from a carefully Christian point of view. He also recognizes the potential there is for ambiguity between fairy tale magic and ideas of occult spiritual power within the real world. And particularly, he realizes that because this story is set in London, in contrast to his other stories, which are in Narnia. So he frames his colorful pixie dust magic as something that cannot be pursued in rural London without questionable means. Those who pursue fairy tale magic outside of the magical land of Narnia do so as interlopers who are dabbling in things they don't understand, who are stepping outside the bounds of what is healthy for them and outside of what is right and healthy and good to experiment with. And this is the case even though the kind of colorful fantasy magic contained in the Narnia stories, as well as with the Harry Potter stories, could never be confused with anything reflecting real life beliefs or practices of any past or present group. Magic within fairy tale universes tends to have, and that is the case with these stories, tends to have less in common with some kind of practice and more in common with just the instinctive play acting of children. This is the way Jerram Bars from Covenant Seminary frames it, is the idea that the kind of magical thinking that tends to characterize make-believe play in children of any kind, the kind of thing that happens when somebody without any external influence just spontaneously imagines that daddy's scarecrow out in the fields can actually talk, or that your stuffed bear ought to actually be able to walk and talk and give you a hug. That kind of use of the word magic has nothing to do with any culture's spirituality, whether of the accepted variety or of the taboo, more occult variety. It has nothing to do with those. It simply emerged from imagination and creativity in a spirit of play. And I think that's the kind of magic really that we're talking about here. Anyway, so we recognize that the concept of magic in Narnia has always been of the purely fantasy or fairy tale variety, in which we simply imagine for the fun of it that there are magical laws of nature that we know there actually aren't, almost like a pretend subcategory of science. But in this book, for somebody to tap into those imaginary magical principles in the context of, let's say, London, requires some presumptuous and destructive interloping into things you don't understand, and requires learning from shady characters who don't understand the very things they're sharing with you. And through these kinds of dabbling pursuits, Uncle Andrew finally discovered that what that mysterious box contained was actually dust from another world. Uncle Andrew says, I knew that if only you could get it into the right form, the dust would draw you back to the place it had come from. And then, with much experimentation, finally he used that sand to make the yellow rings. And then we get another glimpse into C.S. Lewis's moral and relational value system, because Diggory says, and all I can say, Diggory added, is that you've behaved like a coward, sending a girl to a place you're afraid to go yourself. It seems like courage and cowardice are part of Lewis's moral framework, but perhaps primarily their role within the relational framework. Mistreating others due to cowardice is perhaps a more significant vice than cowardice by itself. And I think the themes in this book on the relationship between fear and morality has a particularly Christian quality, particularly if you read carefully and you compare it to parts of the biblical wisdom tradition contained in books like Proverbs. Biblically, there's a specific kind of fear that characterizes the wicked and a specific kind of fear that characterizes the righteous. And throughout this story, Uncle Andrew and Jadis are unafraid of things like forbidden magic or criminality, intruding into places they don't belong, breaking moral codes, defiling their own moral character. But they're terrified of Aslan and purity and goodness and getting trapped within moral constraints and anything that makes them vulnerable, or of losing their power or of failing to gain power. Meanwhile, the heroes are understood to feel it right to have a healthy fear of doing wrong, fear of joining the wicked, fear of succumbing to temptation, and a healthy fear with love for Aslan, which cancels out the horror of that fear and causes the terrified person to walk toward the object of fear instead of away. And so, in light of all that, here Diggory calls Uncle Andrew a coward. In fact, Uncle Andrew's cowardice is a distinctive marker of his evil character. But Uncle Andrew could very well call Diggory a coward for preferring not to pursue dubious magical arts, for preferring not to break his word, not to behave immorally. In the end, it's clear that everybody, good and evil, everybody has fear. But your moral character is shaped by which fears you choose to pursue and which you choose to step away from. Now, let's pause for a minute here and take a minute to think about how these themes show up in similar ways in the Bible. The themes of fear, courage, and cowardice as markers of morality in the context of spirituality under God. Now, if you want to skip this part and get back to the Narnia story, feel free to use the chapter markers to skip this section. But I just put it in here because I just think it's really cool to be able to think about and look at how biblical themes play out in C.S. Lewis's storytelling. So all the citations I'm going to provide here come from the book of Proverbs. So these are wisdom sayings from a book that intends to provide a framework for viewing the world in order to empower the wise person to, through wisdom and introspection, to live better and live wisely in the real world. Some of the sayings will be considered more conventional in nature. Others are intended to be more paradoxical or cryptic. But none of the sayings are intended to be read glibly, and none of them are intended to be read simplistically or scientifically. What they are is meditative wisdom sayings designed for meditation and reflection, and usually they contain multiple points of insight or implicit suggestiveness under the surface the more you reflect on them. Anyway, so first off, the one I want to mention is Proverbs 21:29. A wicked man puts on a bold face, but the upright man considers his way. In this proverb, it could almost seem like confidence is being equated with wickedness. What we definitely do get is a priority on thoughtfulness and carefulness in that second phrase, the idea that the upright man considers his way. I think there's also an implication for our themes that sometimes the paths of immorality are paved with boldness, which is something similar to courage, and which is definitely related to the concept of fear. And the immediate parallel that may come to mind for many of us is Proverbs 28:1 that says, "The wicked flee when no one is pursuing them, but the righteous is bold as a lion." This proverb is invoking a completely different set of situations than the last one, but when we apply it to our discussion about fear, we find that it's basically expressing the exact opposite. In this proverb, it is the righteous who are bold, and specifically because of their righteousness. Whereas the foolish man blusters through things he ought to be afraid of in 21:29, here in 28:1, the righteous is the one who is bold. And perhaps he's bold because he has spent the time to, as it says in 21:29, to consider his way thoroughly and reverently under God. Meanwhile, there's also a fear that can hunt down and terrorize the wicked. In 28:1, it says, "The wicked flee when no one's pursuing them." And this is placed in contrast to the bold confidence of the righteous. I think a good way to paraphrase the concept into modern American idiom might be something like, some people don't have to be afraid of life catching up with them, some people do. And the wisdom writers are tapping into the collective awareness that certain paths of life include immoral choices that result in people having to live a life of constantly looking for danger, constantly taking further and further measures to evade justice, so that the end result is that, in effect, they are fleeing even though nobody's pursuing them. And then we get Proverbs 28:14, which uses a little bit of paradox and cryptic wit when it says, "Happy is the person who fears continuously, but he who is stubborn of heart will fall into calamity." Happy is the person who fears continuously, but he who is stubborn of heart will fall into calamity. So this time, the wise person or the righteous person is the one who does fear. And by implication, since this is what contrasts him from the stubborn person who falls into calamity, by implication, his continuous fear is what keeps him from that path. And it results in happiness. I think we could suggest also, based on the rest of the things we've been reading, it also results in wisdom, moral integrity, and a sense of peace and rest in life. Stubbornness, meanwhile, similar to the boldness of the wicked, which can include brashness but doesn't have to, seems to be a lack of fear, since these two phrases are in contrast, and it results in calamity. A more literal translation would be the one who hardens his heart, which is a Hebrew figure of speech, which becomes a little more poetic than to just say stubborn. The fear in 28:14 doesn't specify what it is that's being feared. Some translations render the word is reverent or say fears the Lord to eliminate the ambiguity. I personally don't usually like the trend in translations to take cryptic, ambiguous things and make them sound simpler or safer. I think particularly when you're in the genre of wisdom literature, I think there ought to be some provocative ambiguity to grab a hold of us and demand our attention. I think a wisdom saying like this is supposed to be shocking and perplexing on its face, because everybody knows that constant fear does not equal happiness. The sage here says that it does, and he uses that contrast to open our minds. The person who, in some cryptic way, the person who is always fearing is somehow a person who is in some overriding way to be thought of as happy. And this is to be understood in contrast to the stubborn person who has a massive explosive reason to not be happy. And we could say, if we would like, maybe this latter person is the person who ought to be afraid of something. This is the person who has something to be afraid of, but he's not. And then to finish off a quick survey here, you can't leave out the most central concept in the whole of the Old Testament wisdom tradition, which is the concept of the fear of the Lord. Proverbs 1 verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Proverbs 2:5, if you seek wisdom, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and discover the knowledge of God. Proverbs 9:10, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding, etc. Proverbs 14:2, whoever lives with integrity fears the Lord, but the one who is devious in his ways despises him. And then perhaps even more memorably, the cryptically cynical wisdom text of Ecclesiastes, which constantly challenges our view of orderliness and justice and goodness in the world around us with the relentless refrain, everything is futility and chasing the wind. That book memorably finishes with, here is the final conclusion, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. So suffice it to say, according to the ancient wisdom writers of ancient Israel, the fear of God is kind of the answer to everything when it comes to wise living in the real world. But the result isn't actually a state of being afraid. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Consider the often quoted Proverbs 29:25. The fear of man is a snare, but the one who trusts in the Lord is safe. The fear of man is a snare. The one who trusts in the Lord is safe. In that proverb, the path of wisdom isn't even framed as fear. It's framed as trust, but it's referring to the same thing, the same reverent living, the same path of the wise, righteous person. And it's contrasted with the fear of people, the fear of humans, the governing impulse of obeying your felt need to please others because of their weightiness and impact. The fear of people, this proverb suggests, is a snare. The fear of the Lord, in contrast, is peace and trust and rest. So it's in light of that extended theme throughout the whole of the wisdom tradition of the Old Testament scriptures. It's in light of that I think we get our most fascinating understanding of how C.S. Lewis is using his thematic storytelling here in The Magician's Nephew. Because fear is a key part, I think, of C.S. Lewis's moral framework that distinguishes his villains from his heroes. Fear, courage, cowardice, things like that. And I think also, practically speaking, it's helpful for us to distinguish between felt fear that makes you feel, let's say, anxious, versus warranted fear. The fool is bold when he ought to fear. He avoids what he ought to pursue, and he pursues what he ought to avoid. Both the wicked person and the righteous person will, by their very definition, have to choose to live with deferential fear toward one thing and dismissiveness or avoidant fear or disrespect toward the other. And the thing that you're dismissive or avoidant or disrespectful of is probably the thing that you'll have warrant to actually be afraid of at some point, whether or not you have enough wisdom to feel that fear with self-awareness and stuff like that. So, for example, to speak in non-spiritual terms, you can either have deferential fear toward justice and avoidant fear toward the injustice of criminality, or you can have deferential fear toward the criminal impulse or criminal subculture, and avoidant or dismissive or disrespectful fear toward justice and the protective forces of good within society. And I think the message of Scripture, as well as the message of the Narnia stories, is that these forces work in a mild and imperfect manner here under the sun, but they increasingly demand our attention the more we lift our eyes above the mundane toward the divine, toward the transcendent, toward the source of all existence, the source before whom no one can stand in person without trembling knees. So, in the case of Uncle Andrew, he has evasive fear for the light and deferential fear for the darkness. He chooses to have a warranted fear of coming into contact with justice and an admiring fear of the powers of injustice and evil that he thinks he can use to serve himself. On a personal level, he admired Mrs. Lefay, and later he will admire Queen Jadis. They don't have any actual concern for him, and he doesn't have any actual concern for them, but he admires them because he admires what they stand for and thinks that his advancement and happiness in life will come from his proximity to them and what they stand for. So, for the reader, we could say that perhaps the implicit question this book can be thought of as asking us in terms of its argument for morality might be something like this. Reader, which items of fear do you want to be the plausible risks for your life, which you may dismiss or feel fear for, or avoid, or try to manage? Which ones do you want to be the plausible risks for your life, and which items of fear do you want to live your life in reverent deference toward? Because you don't get to pick whether you're going to exist in relation to fear. You only get to pick which fears you will fear in which way. And the paradigm becomes even more impactful when you lift your eyes up above the skyline, which Uncle Andrew never does. Uncle Andrew's only sense of awe is the awe you feel for the darkness that tugs you downward, the gripping power of supernatural evil. That which is above the sun in its transcendent splendor disgusts Uncle Andrew and repulses him. In fact, he has completely lost his ability to see it for what it really is. In a sense, it's almost as if some kind of Faustian bargain has locked his eyes shut. But for those who can see, Uncle Andrew's boldness and his fear are the path of disappointment and loneliness. Anyway, so Diggory says that Uncle Andrew is a coward for sending a girl to a place where he wouldn't go himself. Uncle Andrew retorts that that wouldn't make any sense because he's too important and valuable to do such a thing. And then in the midst of that retort, we get a little wisdom nugget to add to Uncle Andrew's position statement that we set up from before. Because in the midst of that, he says, "No great wisdom can be reached without sacrifice." Which is definitely true as a generality apart from context. No great wisdom can be reached without sacrifice. But of course, within this particular context, this is actually the kind of argument that actual purveyors of evil will actually make. And I love how, even in this fantastical children's story type of context, C.S. Lewis is actually presenting bits of actual intellectual arguments, but for kids and in language that kids can understand. I think part of his goal maybe is that as his readers grow up, they'll have these concepts in their heads from back when they were forced to grapple, at least in small ways, with the logic of evil Uncle Andrew, and to grapple with how much sense Uncle Andrew makes in certain perverse ways. And even though Uncle Andrew is a kind of cartoony, exaggerated fairy tale character, he's not a straw man that only says silly things, because in the midst of all his silliness, which we do have in this book here, he's also supposed to actually make Diggory and the reader consider many of the things he says. Anyway, so finally, Uncle Andrew explains to Diggory that the green rings have the power to draw you back from wherever this other place is. And Diggory realizes that he really has no choice but to do what Uncle Andrew wants him to do, which is to take a yellow ring and a green ring and go after Polly, which is what Uncle Andrew had been planning from the beginning. And I love the simplistic, childlike elegance of Diggory's final words before he goes. He says, "Very well, I'll go. But there's one thing I jolly well mean to say first. I didn't believe in magic till today. I see now it's real. Well, if it is, I suppose all the old fairy tales are more or less true, And you're simply a wicked, cruel magician like the ones in the stories. Well, I've never read a story in which people of that sort weren't paid out in the end, and I bet you will be, and serve you right. And in keeping with the theme of various kinds of fear, something in this speech actually triggers something in Uncle Andrew because Uncle Andrew gives a bit of a start and shows, quote, horror for a moment, but then he laughs it away. And uh, and I like the playful little reference to, quote, old fairy tales in Digory's little mini speech there. I think C.S. Lewis understands fairy tales and myth to contain intuitional representations of certain moral principles that are embedded in the universe as God's created order. Things like the idea of moral order being fundamental to the created order. And I think one of those intuitional concepts would be the intuition and the passionate longing that, quote, in the end, as Diggory put it, in the end, all chaos will be turned right side up. All evil will be made right or brought to justice or something like that. C.S. Lewis knows enough to know that the simplicity and cardboard cutout two-dimensionality of fairy tales is only just that. After all, this is the guy who wrote The Problem of Pain, and later on he wrote A Grief Observed. But I think he's suggesting as well that there is some echo of something true contained within those intuitions. There is some sense, some distant memory that collective humanity has been trying to forget that comes through in those kinds of ways. And as he suggests as well by his exaggerated and children's fiction-esque portrayal of Uncle Andrew's moment of horror, he suggests in a kind of cartoony and exaggerated form the more subtle and hidden reality that is sometimes in the real world, that the evil sometimes do harbor a growing inner fear because of their own recognition of the reality that they are defying. As it says in Proverbs, the path of the wicked is characterized by being bold and choosing not to doubt. But if they really understood the deepest kinds of magic, to use Aslan's language, if they really understood the most fundamental realities, they would realize that they have great warrant for fear. And so it would seem that Uncle Andrew, in his journeys and searches, he has come into contact with some frightening forms of evidence or sources of knowledge that caused him to question his path, caused him to see some shocking evidence of what fear is warranted that he's been dismissing his whole life. In order to remain evil, sometimes it requires pushing through one's own self-doubts. It requires suppressing and even repressing all the misgivings and hesitancies and any intuitions or impulses that would serve as a corrective from those worst parts of that path. This is why the neurological markers associated with the brain of the psychopath tend to result in the most shocking kinds of criminality, because those are the people who have kind of got a head start in overcoming the inbuilt counterbalances against certain of the most heinous kinds of actions. So anyway, Uncle Andrew here, in a cartoony way, as a character in a children's story, he kind of demonstrates that even though he is very bold and courageous in his battle against the good and very cowardly in his battle against the evil, there's still a little voice inside him saying that he has chosen the wrong courage and the wrong cowardice. And this is the same horror, I think, that later makes Uncle Andrew and Jadis hate and be afraid, in the avoidant kind of fear, of Aslan. You could say that the character of Aslan is really quite deeply connected to this intuitive sense Diggory has, this sense of the in the end moral order, which is something that Uncle Andrew's not going to escape. Now, we should note that that final line, serve you right, has kind of a vindictive attitude that definitely wouldn't comport with Christianity. In the Bible, we find some version of the idea of not rejoicing in the suffering of your enemies. We find that not only in the teachings of Jesus, but throughout the more ancient wisdom traditions. See especially Job 31, verse 29, Proverbs 24:17, Proverbs 25:21. And I think the Narnia stories are definitely following that Christian attitude. I think putting the words serve you right in the mouth of Diggory doesn't suggest that that's a good attitude to have, because Diggory actually isn't supposed to be the shining hero character, but rather the relatable protagonist for most of this story. Aslan, for example, would never have said serves you right. But Diggory here is playing the role of the everyman. He's the representative for the average reader, and he is furious at his uncle, and he hates his uncle. And it comes out in some understandably spiteful and vindictive words. Now, it's also interesting how Uncle Andrew brushes off Diggory's beliefs and perspectives here. He brushes that off as being associated with being, quote, brought up among women. This is a really consistent pattern, probably through many generations, it wouldn't surprise me, in which Christian morality is associated with femininity. Women tend to prefer more morality, probably because morality implies stability. And women also tend to be more drawn to spirituality in general than men are, probably because women are more emotionally and intuitionally attuned. Similar reason, I think, to the fact that in the country there are more people who believe in God than in the city, because nature and time spent openly in quiet nature type contexts tends to ignite your intuitions in ways that are not going to happen as much in the bustling city. And plenty of other reasons as well that influence that, such as the fact that universities tend to lean in that direction and things like that. But we're getting off topic. The main thing here, Uncle Andrew belittles Digory's moral impulses as being reflective of his femininity, as being shaped by his relationships with women and being raised by women, something that might shape a child's point of view, but which he ought to be expected to grow out of. So Digory is good because he's a little kid and he's a little girl. And I'm guessing that the reason C.S. Lewis puts this in here, because this is something that real people say, I'm assuming this is probably the kind of association that he's heard people say about his kind of faith. So then, without even trying, he kind of slides that into the mouth of Uncle Andrew. And then the conclusion of the chapter gives us a little bit of a window into Digory's motivations and values. Last chapter, we noticed that Digory's personality is excited by curiosity and adventure and the search for knowledge and excitement. We also saw in this chapter, from his insults to his uncle, that in terms of his moral values, he despises cowardice, and particularly the interpersonal aspect of cowardice that is willing to hurt somebody like Polly just to protect yourself. But now in these last moments of the chapter, Digory has, at this point, he's already agreed to go because he realizes he doesn't have a lot of choice. But he hesitates for this one moment here because of one of the other biggest motivations in his whole being. He hesitates because it suddenly occurs to him, and so he says it out loud. What about Mother? Supposing she asks where I am? It seems like no matter what else is going on, and no matter where Polly is, or no matter what great unexplored worlds are waiting for him, Digory's mind keeps going back to his mother. I'm guessing C.S. Lewis probably includes this here, maybe for two reasons. First, maybe to remind the reader that Digory's mother is really important to the story and is always going to be in the background. The reader must not forget about this single most important character in our story. I think that's why C.S. Lewis included the mother both at the beginning of this chapter and at the end of this chapter, because at this groundwork laying stage, we cannot be allowed to forget how important she is to the story and to Digory. But then secondly, I think he probably does this just because this is what Digory would think and say at this point. Because all the grief he's been experiencing and all the passion and feeling that's been churning around inside him keeps him coming back to the most important thing in his whole life right now. His suffering, weak, hurting mother who he loves. His longing for his mother to be well, and his passionate commitment to do anything and everything he can for her. Even when things so big and massive are happening to him, he hesitates because he remembers his mother, because she's bigger than all these other big things. Power may be motivating one part of this story, but love is driving the other. Well, anyway, Uncle Andrew deals with that hesitation. He doesn't try to force the boy to go, but instead he uses the same kind of low emotional manipulation he used near the beginning of the chapter. He basically uses implicit threats with guilt. He just opens the door and tells the boy he can leave if he wants. And Polly may be ripped to shreds by wild animals or who knows what, and then you'll have to go tell Mrs. Plummer that Polly is gone for good and it's your fault for not going after her, you know. And I think Digory knew what a low blow this was. He knew what a low blow it was early on when his uncle brought up his mother to make him be quiet, and he knows what a low blow this is right now. So in terms of our understanding of the motivations of Digory as a character, what we've got so far is that Digory cares about adventure, he cares about his mother, but he's also committed to doing the right thing. Digory's moral impulse and his commitment to protect others and do whatever good he can is also a significant motivator in his personality. Even though he knows his uncle is manipulating him, and he knows that his uncle has created this mess, he also knows that he would rather try to help Polly and try to do some good in this mess, rather than resist his uncle for the sake of resistance. So, after expressing his anger, then the final paragraph of the chapter says, Then he buttoned up his coat, took a deep breath, and picked up the ring. And he thought then, as he always thought afterward too, that he could not decently have done anything else. And I think that's just the coolest way to finish off that chapter. In the face of evil, Diggory is able to maintain some amount of a clear vision of the difference between right and wrong, and he'd rather protect the innocent and maintain his own conscience than defy the wicked uncle and stay safe as a selfish coward. So he chooses danger and the good instead of safety and protecting what he's afraid of losing. And in the end, of course, we know by the end of the book, it's these kinds of decisions that are going to ultimately lead him to actually getting back his mother in a way that he never had her before. But that's way off in the distance. We're going to take some time to get there. Meanwhile, I'm looking forward to getting into chapter 3, The Wood Between the Worlds. Maybe I'll see you then. Hey there, if you want to see more videos talking about sci-fi and fantasy in light of things like psychology, philosophy, and spirituality, then make sure you hit that subscribe button. But anyway, I will see you in the next one.